Okay, so welcome back to our webinar. We're joined now by Sara Phillips, who's the chair of Transgender Equality Network Ireland, Ellen Murphy, who is a shop steward in Leinster House. She is a former secretary of the Abortion Rights Campaign Ireland and an LGBT rights activist. And then from the FSU, our own Gareth Murphy, who's head of industrial relations and campaigns at the FSU. Gareth, can I come to you first? Because maybe what we might do is just go with a kind of an overview of the situation. Is it safe to say that that LGBT people are fairly well covered in terms of rights and protections related to their employment?
I think there are basic rights and protections there in place that effectively say you can't be discriminated against on the grounds of your gender or your sexual orientation. There's actually 9 grounds, but gender and sexual orientation are 2 of the 9 grounds. And it's kind of a negative protection in that it says you shouldn't be treated less favorably in the areas of maybe pay, recruitment for a job. So when you go for a job interview and general working conditions. But that's not to say that prejudice, discrimination, harassment, bullying and things like that don't happen, because they do happen. And that's the sad reality that our colleagues in the LGBT community face in work. Still is prejudice and there still is discrimination. So while the law is formally there in terms of equality, there's a long way to go in terms of winning real meaningful equality, fairness and decency in the workplace for LGBT people.
Can we deal with some of the basics? If I'm applying for a job, am I required to have to reveal my LGBT identity to an employer?
And no, you're not. So you're not required to. And the only reason, obviously, it's up to individuals to decide what they want to do in terms of their identity. And the only reason really you should ever disclose kind of personal information like that is if you think it's going to impact on your work and you may require kind of things that are reasonable adjustments to your workplace. I think that wouldn't apply to sexual orientation or gender, but it may be some other consequence that you feel a reasonable adjustment might be required. And that's a situation where you may choose to reveal to your employer. So in order to get some support or some assistance, but you don't have to. And it's totally your choice. Having said that, a lot of employments now will have employee networks, or a lot of unions will have union groups that you may wish to get involved in. And so, absolutely, disclosing your gender or your sexual orientation is to your advantage to do. So you don't have to, but you may choose to, and it may be good for you to do, but I think the most important thing is that you're deciding to do it for a positive reason rather than being made to it.
And what about in terms of health issues? So particularly in relation to HIV, if I was somebody living with HIV, would I have to reveal that information to my employer?
So I suppose, again, like I said, you don't have to. And I believe many people live with HIV in work, and it has absolutely no impact on their ability to work at all. And so this may never need to be a question. However, like any illness or condition or disability, if it's going to impact on your work, then it can be advisable to seek reasonable adjustments. And what that really is, that's making your work and your working conditions work for you and work around you, rather than you having to bend and you having to change to suit the work. It's try to actually make work suit you. So if whatever it is, HIV or another illness, disability, condition, etc., if that's going to impact on your work, you may want to disclose it in order to get reasonable adjustments. But if it isn't, then absolutely you don't have to. And again, it just comes back to it's your decision.
In terms of if you experience discrimination or bullying, let's say, from other people in work, is your employer obligated to have to support you in that situation?
So join a union. So your union is the thing that's most there to support you in your workplace, whatever it is, right? So sometimes people think HR are there to be on your side. They're not really. HR are there to make sure the minimal legal protections are in place and the employer actually isn't exposed to the risk of litigation. That's really HR's job. Our job as a trade union, not just our job, but the community of trade unionists are there to make work a better, more positive, more decent experience for everyone. So like I kind of started with, the law does the very basics, but a lot of prejudice, a lot of discrimination and issues don't fit neatly into a legal case. They need the help of your colleagues around you on your work team, your union rep or shop steward, or maybe one of the paid professional staff in the union. But it's much better dealt with if you have the support of colleagues. That's what the union is there for, because often the law just doesn't quite deal with the reality of people's working experience.
You mentioned shop stewards there, and of course we have one on our panel in the form of Ellen. Ellen, I'm an employee in a situation where I'm being bullied by other employees or by my boss or my employer directly. I come to you. What happens? What do I do? How does this process work?
So the first thing as a shop steward that I would do is have a discussion with yourself about what's gone on, ask you if you've kept a record of what's been going on. But while obviously the unique nature of being a member of the queer community is that when you receive bullying and experience bullying in work on those grounds, it's exceptionally personal, and it, as is all kind of bullying work, but it is an innately personal issue. So of course I'd be quite sensitive towards that. But there are some basics that absolutely every employee, no matter what the issue is, no matter what your sexual orientation, no matter what your gender identity is, that you're entitled to. You're entitled to, I would go to HR and I would get a copy of the processes. So HR, as Gareth has mentioned there, they are employed by the same employer that you are, but they are employed for them, not necessarily for you. But they do cover those processes. So I would get a copy of that. We discuss everything that had happened. I'd ask if you'd be comfortable writing it down. And then there's a bunch of different avenues that we can go down. You can go down a formal complaints avenue. Your workplace may have a mediation option. We can look at that, bearing in mind that you, as anyone else, would not be mandated to do mediation, and mediation is entered into voluntarily and is non-binding. So it is a case that if you want to give it a go, you can, but absolutely you're not going to be forced in any way to sit in a room with someone who's been bullying you and listen to them do it again. And as your shop steward, I would be there to support you through all of this, to advise you through all of this. If we needed further advice, legal advice from the union, or particularly in the case of individual discrimination cases, you might need more detailed advice, we would refer that through via the shop steward through the official. But the main thing is to remember, for anyone listening, that your gender identity and your sexual orientation and your personal and your private life is as valid a reason for you to come to your union rep as it is any other issue. If it is causing an issue in work, it is causing an issue for your union. And as your union shop steward, we're as much there for you on that ground as we are for anybody else. So if anyone's listening and thinking, well, maybe that's not relevant, it is relevant. You're a worker, and if you're being made feel uncomfortable in work for any reason, you need to go to shop steward. And as Gareth said, the first step to all of that is joining your union.
One of the things people often ask is, well, if I'm not in the union, do I still have the same rights as other people who'd be working around me who are in the union?
Yeah, so that varies depending on situations. Generally, no, if you're not a member of the union, you don't have the same access to the resources. Some unions, and again, I'm a member of SIP2 and I used to work for another union in the UK, Unison. Some unions have rules around what's called joining with a problem. So usually you have to have an established membership to prove that people don't just join the union, use the services, and then leave it, because we're not a service, we're not a professional legal service, we're a political workplace, we're a union movement, and there's solidarity that you will be asked as a member of a union to show to others, and that then is returned to you. And there's constantly work going on in the background. If you think that a union isn't every single day advocating for you in meetings with HR, negotiating pay, the public service pay agreements are going on now, but those go on at an individual employment level all of the time. I know, because I'm currently heading one up here in the Oireachtas. So your union is always working for you, whether you're a member or not. So being a member, however, does have its advantages, because you can lean directly on us when you have a personal situation in work that you need. So it's always valuable to be part of your union. And I do think in recent years, the high profile campaigns, particularly around marriage equality, have shown in a really practical and personal way to our community the value of solidarity. And I know, as a young queer person, it definitely helped politicize me, and it got me engaged again in my union politics, because that's all about standing together and standing with others. So yeah, you're much safer off in your union, because your union works for you, HR works for your employer. So, you need your union.
We've kind of focused mostly on the individual in what we've talked about so far, but none of us are really individuals in our real life situations, and we have family in different situations. And in recent years, I think the LGBT community has experienced a growth in the numbers of same-sex headed families. But our same-sex headed families covered by the legislation the same as opposite sex headed families?
Unfortunately, I mean, in the main, yes, as Gareth pointed out, there are bases for discrimination which are covered by this. It's two of the identified grounds. However, a lot of the legislation which dictates our lives at work around things like parental leave, maternity leave, sick leave, those things weren't, and family leave, were never really designed with queer people and our community in mind. And the fact that gender plays a role in access to paid leave, when you're having kids, paternity leave, that's definitely an issue. And there is a move, particularly by opposition parties, but also by government, some decent people in government who are pointing this out, and the fact that we need to adjust our working regulations to reflect the fact that you might have the same, two gendered led, same gender led family. So who has paternity leave, in the case of trans community, accessing things like maternity leave and paternity leave and parental leave is also very difficult. So actually, another really good example that affects a lot of people in the community is access to pregnancy loss leave and miscarriage leave after IVF. And Marie Sherlock is currently progressing legislation that would allow everyone and anyone who has to go through IVF, which many of us in the community do have to do to have kids, can have that access to time off. So there's definitely a lag in the legislation to represent all families. And we saw that after marriage equality as well, when you had marriage equality, but then there were subsequent issues around pensions and recognitions of long-term partners, and there still are parental recognition issues as well. So there's definitely a lag, but the union movement is an active part of that lobbying to see that change. And that's why it's coming from usually left-wing pro-union parties who are pushing this agenda. So again, it's just another good reason to join your union and to make sure that your experience is counted when we're making those policy proposals to government and opposition parties.
Gareth, can I just come back to you for a second? If I was interested in joining the union, what's involved? Like, am I paying weekly, monthly? What way does it go? What kind of fees are involved?
So it's mostly monthly fees, but some may operate weekly. But FSU, so if you're working in the finance or the tech sector, it's a monthly subscription. You can join online fully in FSU. Again, a lot of unions you can join online. There may be something to sign after you filled out the online form, but in FSU you can join fully online, and encourage everyone to do so in the workplace. Is the best way of achieving real meaningful equality. Like I said, policies are on paper, the laws on paper, but we need to move to a place of meaningful equality where everyone feels comfortable working in decent jobs and everyone has respect and gives respect.
Sara, can I come to you now at this point? Because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I wonder if for the trans community, there are other more complicated issues that might be involved in terms of being an employee, and maybe at a later stage in life, deciding that you want to begin transitioning and what that might involve. In your work in Kenny, what kind of experiences have you come across of people?
Yeah, and thanks, Carl. I just want to go back maybe to something Gareth said
Sure.
about the main grounds of discrimination, and that's something that's key from a trans perspective, is that there's an assumption under the 9 grounds, specifically under the gender ground, that transgender people are covered under that ground. And that's based on specifically a legal case that was taken by Louise Hannon back in 2011, but it was taken through the Equality Authority, and therefore there's no precedent on it. So there isn't really precedent set that the inclusion of gender identity or gender expression within that gender ground covers a trans person. There's an assumption. We've seen some cases go through the Workplace Commission, which have all been found positively, so that's really reassuring. However, that's not a guarantee. And so in the review of the Equality Status and Employment Acts at the moment that are going on, we are trying to ensure that the words gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics are included in that legislation, because that would then explicitly cover the trans community from discrimination, specifically in employment. I suppose from what you mentioned about, the experience of the trans community within the workplace, it's quite complicated in lots of ways. You have mixed results basically from people trying to access work in the first place, but also trying to transition in the workplace. And one of the key things, especially with people trying to transition in the workplace, there's a lot of companies don't really have policies within their diversity and inclusion policies that again explicitly support the trans person in the workplace about transitioning. So again, going back to something Gareth said earlier about maybe outing yourself at the interview stage or at the employment stage, a trans person coming into employment may need to do that if they've already transitioned, but they may still be within that space. They may need to take some time off for medical treatment, etc., and they may need some support around that. But a lot of companies would not have, taken that into account in their policies. So it's about trying now to work with a lot of companies, make sure that there are explicit and understandable policies in place, that people know what their rights are. And again, working with your unions specifically, and unions in this situation have been unbelievably supportive over the years to the trans community. Going back to SIP2 support of our very first ever, guidelines around trans inclusion in the workplace many, many years ago. But I think the key piece now is that companies need to live that culture. It's not just about producing a document, letting people know that you're supportive, but it's also that individuals within the company know that this is available, not just the trans people, but it's also about your colleagues and the management, etc. So I think there's a big piece of work that has to happen here, starting from companies being open to hire trans people. Some of the data talks about 49% of trans people being unemployed, but 24% of them not even wanting to apply for a job for the simple reason that they're afraid of the unconscious bias or the screening out of them at the interview or at the employment stage. So there's a huge body of work there to do at the moment, and we've been trying to work with some really key employers and associations, etc., to try and start that work going.
It's a pity that people feel that the environment that they might be going, like if they have a desire to work in a particular area or a particular company, that they feel that they may not get the support or the confidence that they need in order to be able to go into that employment. And I think it's one of the things that earlier when I was talking to Jeff Dudgeon, he talked about the chilling effect that the policy to eliminate gay and bisexual men from the care sector in Northern Ireland had right across the board for people. In terms of like some of the points that you were making there, is there a need for legislation in order to ensure that trans people in employment are protected and covered? Or do you think that it's just about changing culture and people's understanding?
I think, as I mentioned just earlier on, I think it's definitely twofold. I think there's a clear need for legislation. There's no doubt about that. I think there's also a need for that protection within the grounds of discrimination. And I think then also there is a lot of work to be done, both, I suppose, within the workplace around diversity and inclusion policies, but also within the workplace culture. Because again, for most part, most employees don't experience a trans person in the workplace very often because there's not that many of us in the first place. So, I think there's as I said earlier, it's a huge amount of work that has to be done societally to understand the trans community's needs, but also to protect them when they're going into the workplace. And I do think, again, there are ways of doing that. There is legislative ways, there is cultural ways, there's policy ways, but there's also then benefiting, the support of your union as well. And I think in that situation, it's about bringing all of those things together as quickly as we possibly can. So therefore, the trans community are protected.
I'm going to come back to Gareth and Ellen in just a second, just to ask them about what role the unions can play. But I know, Sara, that Tenny has been involved with IBEC in producing some guidelines and some information for employers. Can you give us a kind of a rough outline as to what that involves? What kind of things have you identified for employers outside of what we've already discussed here?
Yeah, again, I think there's quite a bit of work in the actual policies that we've suggested to IBEC and to other companies that we work with. One of them is transitioning in the workplace. And if you look at that, because a lot of companies will focus on that piece specifically, it's about educating the company, being proactive rather than reactive. In other words, looking at the fact that you may not have a trans person in your workplace, but you still should be looking at training your staff, training your HR department, training your management team, and providing information, around what it means to be trans in the workplace, and then including that in your policies before you have to deal with somebody who may come out within the workplace. Then, secondly, then having a policy and a support system for the trans person if they do come out, so that they understand what are the steps that they can avail of. Also, a piece of that would be always not expecting the trans person to design what that pathway might be, so that it's worked in partnership between the individual and the company at all times. And again, I go back to your union can support you through that as much as anything. But I think it's about that working together approach. This is one of the things that we've done. People who pick out things within the IBEC policy, for instance, will talk about, education. Education is not about at the time of the person coming out. It's about a general education beforehand, as I say, being proactive. And then the other part of it was about looking at hiring policies, understanding maybe some of the nuances of what might affect a trans person applying for a job. One, are you being very open about your hiring policies? Are you welcoming to the trans community? And then secondly, are you understanding what somebody might put in their CV or what they're bringing to the table? For instance, sometimes trans people would have gaps in their CV because they'll have taken time out maybe to transition and will have gone through all that medical process. And you may wonder about that and ignore it, but rather than actually progressing it and talking to them, you need to have an understanding maybe what this means. Not all trans people want to be out in the workplace. That's the other thing. They want to keep that information to themselves. They may bring it out to the management or to the HR department, but they don't necessarily need it, broadcast across the whole of the company. So it's about learning all of those sort of things. And that's kind of the advice that we've been giving, both not just to IBEC, but to also many of the other companies that we deal with.
I think from what you said, it's very basic and understandable stuff that people should try. It's about making the effort to understand what the situation is for people and just facilitating that as best you can. Gareth, I'm not sure if you had anything you wanted to add to that. I mean, we did mention earlier around the issue of HIV, and that for someone I know one of the big things today in terms of HIV is to break down the stigma that's still attached to it, and understand that these days getting a HIV diagnosis is really about learning to live with a lifelong chronic illness. But is there a role for unions in terms of better awareness and training and understanding for either other employees or employers?
There is, yeah, I suppose, and I'll take the issue of kind of breaking down stigmas or creating better awareness and what we can do as a trade union. So we had an example of a case I was involved in, an individual case, but that turns into something more collective and positive from a number of years ago, which was a gay man and his partner, member of ours, were starting their family through surrogacy, and there basically was no leave and no supports in place for him to avail of from his employer. It was a good number of years ago. The employer was fairly decent and well-meaning in that they wanted to provide leave, but they kind of didn't have the tools or mechanisms to do it. So they somewhat bluntly put him on maternity leave, which meant he got paid, which was great. So he got leave and he got paid leave. But he was a man on maternity leave, kind of a bit annoyed about that, I suppose. But what it meant and what it allowed us to do was we obviously talked to the employer, and they were well-meaning. They had wanted to provide him support and to get leave in place and make sure he wasn't at loss of income, which was great. But then they went away and they put in place a surrogacy leave policy, which then we had to learn as well. And I had a lot of learning to do through engaging with my member and listening to them and them telling me the supports they needed, and also the employer. And they were able to engage, I can't remember with who at the time, but with advocacy groups. And it meant then they could take their well-meaning, keep someone in the payroll and keep them getting paid, but turn it into a collective policy that then they can put out on the internet, etc., and to all of their staff. So that's an individual union member with my support, me being able to learn and listen and understand, because it was an area that I didn't know myself. And, you know, as a trade union official, you're often put into areas that you don't know the person's experience. But the one thing you have to do is listen. You have to learn, and then you have to go, right, well, how can I help this situation? That's what you're there to do. And that was an employer who was good enough equally to go, well, we want to do the right thing. So how can we do this? Maybe in the short term, but then actually correct it and have a better policy in place. So that's an example, a real example from a good number of years ago of how an individual issue can be turned into a much positive collective learning, breaking down stigmas, you know, educating, teaching in our union, but then more generally within the workforce and with the staff as well. So again, if they hadn't have been the union member, you know, that might not have happened. So I think the importance of being in a trade union is there.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to remember that, you know, not all employers are bad people, that they want good work situations for their employees, because, you know, it's to their own benefit at the end of the day. They know that if their staff or their workers are happy and feel supported and valued, that they're going to work hard and diligently for their employer as well. Ellen, before we finish up, can I just ask you, did you have anything that you may want to add to that in terms of what role unions can have in terms of breaking down issues around LGBT community?
Well, I think the nail was sort of hit on the head by Sara when she said we have to be proactive, not reactive. And I think generally my experience as being a shop steward has been that, while being very well-meaning, as many places are, as Gareth said, a lot of places will wait for an issue to arise and then decide how to react to it. And usually it's reacting to something with time limits, with under pressure, with emotions running high, because there is really nothing as stressful in work as going through disruption in work and going through a tough time at work, which is usually when you're meeting people as a shop steward. I don't get to meet them on their happiest days usually. So I really think that to bridge that gap, it's important for us as unions to make sure that we're being proactive. So when we go to an HR rep with an issue on behalf of a member and they say, well, I haven't the foggiest how to deal with this, like, well, that's why ICTU and SIP2 and the FSU, with alongside groups like TENI and Belong To, have put in the work to give you templates like that template that Gareth now has for the surrogacy leave. And I think it's really important that we're proactive, because if the employers are being reactive and we're being reactive, there's nobody then in that room able to advocate for the person in the crisis. And again, as Sarah said, it shouldn't be up to the person who's going through this at work to then hold all of our hands collectively and bring it through. We need to be proactive about it. And we also need to make sure that any work that we do as unions on that is given at the grassroots level to shop stewards. Because while I'm a community member and someone who, you know, likes spending her Saturdays at lectures about gender identity and such, that's my idea of fun, not every shop steward in every workforce will have that at their fingertips. So it's really important that we ingrain that as part of our standard training, as we all get training as shop stewards. Some of the issues that you're going to face are going to be these, and this is what you do. And if you don't know what to do, this is who you talk to in the union. But yeah, I think it's about us being proactive, because we can't wait for our employers to be, unfortunately.
Well, I said at the beginning we wouldn't be able to cover all the different issues that people may want to hear about. And I hope what we've at least been able to do is to kind of encourage people to look at getting help and that maybe even think about joining a union in order to be able to have representation if they feel that they need to have that behind them. One of the things I'm delighted to be able to say is that the FSU runs an advice centre, and we will be making that available to people who have specific questions or issues that they want to get information on. Following this, the information on how to contact the advice centre will be coming up. So please stay on to have a look at that. In the meantime, can I thank Sarah, Alan and Gareth for their time coming on here, and I think really helping to throw some light on the issues that people have to face in terms of employment and their LGBT identity. So thank you very much, and I wish you all a very happy Pride.